Thank you very much, all of you, for coming here, especially students. I look forward to engaging in a dialogue with you. And may I especially mention Freni Jinwala. I failed to get in touch with you the day I landed back in the country, which was a month ago. And I owe a great deal to you, Freni, because you persuaded President Mandela to send me out as an international judge. Thank you for the trust you've placed in me. As I was leaving in late August, I was hosted by all the various groups, various regional groups, the European group, the African group, the Arab groups, which is very unusual that each one of them said kind things about me. But the African group said, well, you are our African sister, and when you criticize us, we are inspired to address the criticism. I'm also feel honored, Judge Cricklet, to see you here. Thank you for coming. Many of the ambassadors said to me as I started as High Commissioner for Human Rights, we appreciate that you are a judge, because then you listen to our side of the story. So just to say, I'm very pleased with all of you being here, and particularly my colleagues from my office, the Pretoria office. I don't know whether they're here to ensure I say the right things. Vice-Chancellor De La Rey invited me, thank you very much for the invitation, and she suggested as a possible topic the role of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and then she thought I could cover areas such as the increased role of human rights as a core component of the work of the United Nations, discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, ending impunity, economic, social, and cultural rights, violence and insecurity, development of human rights mechanisms, armed drones and autonomous weapons, Sri Lanka and Syria, or any aspect of the South African relationship with OHCHR's work. And now I know why students hate exam questions. So I have no model answers, and I'm going to cover what I can and look forward to your questions and the dialogue. I would say that human rights really got into the world scene because of the push by civil society, mainly women, who gathered at Vienna. This was the year 1993. We were about to achieve our change to democracy. And so for the very first time, the United Nations had NGOs from all over. I think there were about 4,000 NGOs, and about 50 of us from South Africa. Some of us, like me, attending for the very first time a world conference sponsored by the United Nations. I was part of a lowly NGO person, and I never got out of the basement. But I never realized that one day I will fill the position of High Commissioner for Human Rights that emerged from that conference. You will recall that it's at that conference that the women came up with the slogan that women's rights are human rights. The push then was for the United Nations to establish a person with a strong voice and a mandate to protect and promote human rights all over the world. So the GA resolution then established this mandate. It's very wide, and I interpreted that mandate as protecting all rights of all persons all over the world. It's a huge mandate, as well as the right to development. I was the 5th High Commissioner. I had to resign as a judge on the International Criminal Court because the Secretary General of the United Nations urged me to do so. He said he was seriously concerned about a conference that the High Commissioner for Human Rights was deemed to be the Secretariat, and that's the Durban Review Conference. that was then my first challenge. You will recall that in the year 2000 or 2001, this was just a few days before the 9/11 attack in New York, there was a conference in Durban, a world conference on racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerances. And this is where Colin Powell walked out, many states walked out. But a good outcome document was knocked out by our former Foreign Minister, Nkosazana Zuma, as well as the previous High Commissioner, Mary Robinson. A review conference was scheduled for early 2009, but in that 8-year period, huge propaganda grew against this conference because some said that it was anti-Semitic. It was so bad that every year when the Human Rights Program was presented by the Secretary General for adoption before the UN General Assembly, there was always an obstacle because of the Durban Review Conference. So when I became High Commissioner for Human Rights, it came up again. And this affected, by the way, the entire budget of the United Nations. One year, the US pulled out their donations to the UN altogether for a whole year. And so many of you do not realize how controversial the word Durban became. I received a call just before Christmas. All these things only got resolved at midnight on the 24th December each year. And so I come in as a new person. I wasn't from the UN. The Deputy Ambassador of the United States called me and said, Israel wants to put your program to the vote. And we want to persuade, we don't want, in this instance, we don't want to go along with Israel. But can you remove the word Durban from your papers? It's Durban Declaration and Program of Action. And I said at the phone, what about Vienna? Shall I remove the word Vienna from the Vienna Convention and Program of Action? So there was a dead silence. I put the phone back. So that was my introduction. I'm a judge. And that's the way I handled that. Now, the review conference was held in Geneva. 7 European countries walked out of that conference. President Obama announced that they are not attending. This is South Africa's key contribution, is to support all these initiatives against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia. We have problems in this country. There is a need for South Africa to adopt a national action plan to deal with racism and racial discrimination. I bring this because it was my first challenge to bring to a successful conclusion and an outcome document of the issue of a conference on racism, because it's so close to our experience. We have a great deal to contribute. Right now, and just before I left, I issued public statements expressing deep concern over the resurgence of racism, racial discrimination, and anti-Semitism against migrants, against minorities, and particularly against people of African descent who are detained, arrested, and treated extremely badly. You would have followed that there is now a new European Parliament. Well, 3 of those members of the European Parliament have said extremely damaging statements. One said, for instance, that Islam is like having Nazism back. Another was the Italian MP. Last week I was in Italy, so I said it there. This is an Italian MP in the European Parliament who had actually set alight the mats under the bridges on which migrants had been sleeping. But so he's now sitting in the parliament. So there seems to be a right-wing reaction bringing up these issues. Therefore, the conference named after Durban is very important, and I'm encouraging Europe as well to adopt national action plans to address racism and racial discrimination, and before I came, I followed that you have had a small incident at Pretoria University as well. Well, there are incidents of insensitivity in many parts of the world. It's a human rights issue and needs to be addressed. Now, briefly, let me speak about all the mechanisms that we now have to protect and promote human rights that we did not have before. One key, obviously, is the International Criminal Court, on which I sat, the world's permanent court, which deals with criminal justice. And the principle behind the court is to end impunity. And the fact that such a court was created for the very first time in the 2000, where there was no such institution for accountability from Nuremberg, says to you what important measures are now being adopted by the United Nations to attend to violations of human rights, not only protection and promotion of human rights, but to prevent violations. The General Assembly set up the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council followed the old Human Rights Commission. There were two agenda items on the Human Rights Commission. One was on apartheid South Africa, and the other was the occupation of Palestine by Israel. And since apartheid ended, this Human Rights Council inherited the agenda item on Israel. It's hugely polemical in the Human Rights Council because Israel continually complains that they are being badgered in the council, that they're the only country that is receiving international focus in the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council consists of 47 members. It's highly competitive. South Africa was a member for 4 years until 2009 and has recently been re-elected, so they will be members, I think, until 2017 or something. So the United States became a member after President Obama became president because he wanted to engage in this Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council has one mechanism called the Universal Periodic Review. And under that review, the peers, other states, review the human rights record of every state. The process is webcast. NGOs participate in the process. All 192 states have participated in the first four-year cycle, which I think is an extremely successful undertaking. If you had asked me whether I thought this would happen, say 8 years ago, I would have said I can't see states voluntarily exposing themselves to public scrutiny of their human rights record. So it has happened. Every state is participating, so has South Africa. And all the recommendations made to these states are on the website. So it's very useful to know how, for instance, South Africa is performing in terms of their human rights by looking at what all the other states are saying about it and the recommendations they're making. Now, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights both prepares the human rights report on that country by working closely with civil society here and elsewhere, and by working with the entire UN system. So it's a lot of work. This is what the High Commissioner does, prepares these factual reports. The country comes up with their own reports, and NGOs, as I said, can make presentations there. I think it's extremely interesting that the populations in the various countries can view live the scrutiny of whether their governments are being accountable, whether their governments are complying with their own laws, and so on. Now, the other mechanism are special procedures. These are almost 70 independent experts elected by the Human Rights Council. Once again, a hugely competitive process composed almost entirely of academics who've studied the various aspects. So there are thematic special rapporteurs such as on torture, extrajudicial killing, ending poverty, on water, these are thematic matters, and specific country mandate holders. There are special rapporteurs, for instance, for Eritrea, for Iran, North Korea, and Sudan. These are special country reporters. And I think we should all share with great pride that one of the most important special rapporteur, Professor Christoph Heinz, comes from the University of Pretoria. And I want to take this opportunity, Vice Chancellor and Dean, to thank you sincerely for letting the world share the expertise of Professor Christoph Heinz. He is the expert on extrajudicial killings. It's a long title, arbitrary detention, I think, as well. And he's come up with an expert report on armed drones. He has his own technical names. I think it's autonomous armed robotics. So in his presence, I make sure I get that right. Every country is expected to invite these independent experts in. So assuming it's on migration, or xenophobia here, or violence against women, it's expected that every country should invite these special rapporteurs. And I'm rather saddened that South Africa has not invited several of these experts who have written again and again to come and see the situation on violence against women, torture, and so on. The third dimension of the human rights mechanisms are the treaty bodies. As you know, judges look to the law. They have a framework within which they operate in national systems. So where does the High Commissioner for Human Rights get her standards and her rules from? Obviously, he or she cannot create her own standards. Member states have done so, starting with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, equality and non-discrimination, rights applicable to all, then the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the two key provisions, and you have many more, the Convention on the Rights of Children, the Convention against discrimination against women, the elimination of discrimination against women, which is called CEDAW. There are 10 bodies now, the most recent being the one on disappearances and disabilities. The Committee for Persons with Disabilities is entirely composed of persons with disabilities. So nothing about ourselves without us is their slogan. Now, I found that these treaty bodies were functioning disparately. They were not getting enough resources, not enough meeting time. They had a backlog of thousands of cases. So if somebody has complained or the state is asked to report, it would take like 5 or 6 years for the committee to get to the report of the country concerned. And that's because the treaty bodies were not created as a system. So one of the things I did then is got them all talking. Firstly, to begin within a committee, to get those commissioners to speak to one another. Most of those commissioners are academics, retired judges, retired chief justices. Of course, they're independent, but they have taken that to the extent that they don't really talk amongst themselves. Least of all talking to the members, the commissioners on all the other committees. And what they didn't realize that this division amongst themselves was being capitalized by certain member states. And so they would favor one treaty body with more funding or more meeting time than others. So just getting them all together to talk and getting member states to understand that they created the treaty bodies and they should enable them to function is what took me 3 years of my 6-year term. And I'm very happy to say finally a GA resolution has been adopted. There will be greater funding and more staff for the treaty bodies. And you will appreciate how important these bodies are, They are there to get states to implement all the conventions and treaties. Mine is the voice reminding states, you created these laws, you undertook the obligations, now you should deliver. You should ensure that you stop torture in your country by creating a mechanism, an interministerial mechanism on torture, so that every ministry is involved in addressing the issue of torture as a way of an example. We encourage states to create national human rights institutions, offices, ombuds offices, or the public protector's office as we have here. These are all institutions alternative to the justice system. Obviously, the justice system is a key body to get grievances of the population addressed in a court, both criminal and civil jurisdiction. It's very important that the judiciary remains independent and is properly resourced so that they could function. But these alternate bodies are not in competition with judiciaries. They're there as the bridge between civil society and the authorities. So since I arrived, I've been following the work of our public protector here. And let me say, the message I give here in this country is the message I give in every other country, is to ask the executive to take seriously the recommendations of the Ombuds Office, the Public Protector, the National Human Rights Institutions, because they've gathered the evidence which should alert governments to human rights violations that may become very serious and lead to conflict. Let me say that when I addressed the Security Council, it has been remarked that I have addressed the Security Council far more times, about 15 times, far more times than all the High Commissioners put together. I understand that when my predecessor, Louise Arbour, tried to address the Security Council, she was asked to leave the Security Council. She was told, this is not the place for human rights. It's in Geneva. You go and raise it there. I'm really sad to say the one who took up that position is our South African ambassador. When I became High Commissioner for Human Rights, the same ambassador encouraged me to attend the retreat that was being organized for new members of the Security Council. Since then, I've been invited regularly by the rotating presidents of the Security Council to inform them about the situation of human rights in the countries that are on the agenda of the Security Council. Now, why is that of deep significance? Because they finally recognize that they who have the mandate to protect international peace and security cannot address peace and security without looking at the human rights situation on the ground. So we are the alert to prevent conflict. I addressed the Security Council 3.5 years ago on Syria. I went to the Security Council at their invitation and said, people have taken to the streets demanding their civil and political rights. The majority of the people were excluded from all decision-making bodies in Syria. And so they were asking for their rights. Instead of holding a dialogue, the Assad government shot and killed 1,000. And I begged the Security Council to intervene immediately to refer the situation to the International Criminal Court, because I saw that as crime against humanity. So that's just a background to my work before the Security Council, which is very new, and I do hope that they will invite my successor, Prince Zayed, to do the same. So anyway, back to the 21st of August, I was asked to address the Security Council on prevention of conflict, not just advancement, but how can we prevent the conflict? A very serious question because of our concern over raging conflicts all over the world. Some are extended, such as Syria. So there was Syria, there was Sri Lanka, Ukraine now, Central African Republic, South Sudan, Somalia, and of course Iraq and IS. So what is the relevance of human rights when there are all these conflicts? I decided to give them some positive examples, and I said to them, your first positive example or success is South Africa, because the United Nations passed resolutions against apartheid supporting South Africa. Now that's following their own precepts. Racism is a human rights violation, it's wrong, and you shouldn't be supporting governments who've institutionalized racism. And so at that time, both the General Assembly and the Security Council acted. In fact, the initiative to establish the Convention Against Torture came soon after the death by torture of Stephen Biko. So a great deal of cooperation between the UN and the South African freedom fighters led to our peaceful transition to democracy. So we avoided conflict, and of course we received the support of the international community on this as well. So I did give that as a good example. Now later, if I have time, and I want to express some concerns about how we should be really doing more internationally. I want to say that one other achievement of my office during my 6-year term is to address this political issue that kept coming up in the UN fora, both General Assembly and Human Rights Council. And that's after 9/11, there was such a huge incidence of Islamophobia that obviously the Arab states and all Muslims felt that this was an attack against them. It didn't help that there was a Florida priest who burnt the Quran, and Karzai in Afghanistan whipped up emotions so that there was a riot. The UN was attacked. Our colleagues from the UN were killed, including one staff member of ours. But they wanted it addressed as defamation of religion. It was a struggle to get them to see that you cannot defame a religion, and can we rephrase it? And so I promised during the Durban Review Conference, by way of getting Palestine's cooperation. Palestine was insisting on having 4 paragraphs about them in the outcome document, and the West were hoping that the whole conference will fall on that issue. But I got Palestine to agree that they won't insist on bringing forward those 2 paragraphs by saying I will do one, actively set up the Commission of Inquiry on the 2009 Israeli operation on Gaza. This is where we had Justice Richard Goldstone lead that commission, and the other that I would hold seminars. So we held expert seminars in the 5 regions of the UN on incitement to racial and religious hatred, which resulted in an excellent document, and it was put together by experts from those very own countries. I always see the value of bringing in experts when there's a highly contentious political issue, because experts are able to put it in the framework of rights and freedoms and fundamental norms, all stemming from the Universal Declaration. So do look at that document. It's called the Rabat Plan of Action. As I say, I'm now encouraging that a good plan and strategy has been worked out, and governments should implement that. Now these workshops forever ended this acrimonious division in the Human Rights Council on the religious issue. I read my mandate to mean that I have to address all rights of all persons all over the world. Universal Declaration speaks of equality and non-discrimination. But I found, and the complaint was made to me by many ambassadors from developing states, that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights was operating in a very skewed fashion. We were only looking at civil and political rights. That means freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, the incidence of torture. Most of the donations coming to the office came from Western donors, and that was their interest. It also meant that our attention was directed to faraway places, not the backyards of Europe, faraway places onto developing countries. The issue that raised by developing countries is you have to pay equal attention to economic, social, and cultural rights, poverty, the right to development, because these are issues of concern for developing countries, for the South. Now, as the first High Commissioner coming from the South, you can understand how readily I appreciated that. So there's one thing that I can say we've achieved is address all rights. We've gone a long way to intervene inside the UN to ensure that the post-2015 development agenda has people at the center of policies and decisions, that they have a human rights-based approach. Previously, the Declaration on the Millennium Development Goals focused on targets, that a country will try and save 50,000 women from maternal mortality. And our message is, yeah, what about all the other women who are dying? So you cannot leave anyone behind. That's a human rights-based approach. Huge effort on our part, saying the same thing over and over again. We've made a great deal of progress there. The Secretary General is fully supportive of this issue, and as you know, these developments are very important to us in developing countries. I addressed head-on issues that I was told not to address. So as soon as I was told, do not address the issues concerning gays and lesbians, because that's not a human rights issue, I decided to look into it. And so for the very first time, a resolution has been adopted and asking me, and of course my successor will follow that, to prepare a report on violence and discrimination against LGBTI people. This is what has been done, and it's a very, very first time. There's strong opposition to me. Many ambassadors from certain countries said to me, we like what you're doing, but we don't like you doing that. The objections were that I was creating a new right, that my job is to only look at universally accepted rights, whereas here we're creating a new right. And I said the Universal Declaration of Human Rights doesn't say equality and non-discrimination except for women, except for LGBT, or except for migrants. It covers everyone. So they accepted that because I said I'm dealing with violence and discrimination. The other is caste-based discrimination. Traditionally, India has managed to keep the issue out of the international forum because they felt that they preferred to address that nationally. When I looked into it, I found there was caste-based discrimination in many parts of the world. Latin America, an island outside Japan, Nepal. So many countries are affected. So I said to India, you don't have a monopoly on caste-based discrimination. It's an international issue. And they said, yes, but caste, they said to me, the ambassador, caste comes, that's an Indian word. It's in the Indian context. And I said, yeah, well, so is apartheid. We lent the word apartheid to the rest of the world. You have to now be generous and lend the word caste. Just before I left, I was so moved. There were almost 60 members of the Dalit community based both in Geneva and in India, and they came just to see me. They presented a card. They were weeping because they said this is the first time their issues have been addressed in an international forum, the GA. They fought so hard to have it introduced here in Durban at the World Conference, and were pushed out. So I just mentioned some of the developments during my time, but obviously I have to pay full credit to the work done by all the previous high commissioners on which I have built, and an office of 1,000 who are experts. They can write, I feel, on any subject. So I could lead, but I didn't have the substance that they provided. We are now present in 58 countries. We are present in the peacekeeping operations of the UN. We were never there before. Now everyone realizes you have to worry about the human rights situation as well. I said to Valerie Amos, a former MP of the UK Parliament, she is the head of OCHA, the Humanitarian Affairs, and they had an office, they have an office in Myanmar. Human rights struggle to get offices because countries keep us out. And I said to her, all right, so you are busy looking into the need for food, water, and shelter. 30 women and girls have been kidnapped in the Rohingya community, have been kidnapped by Myanmar soldiers, and they're using them as sex slaves. And you are right there on the ground. What are you doing about it? I give you that as an example to give you an idea how the UN functions. Each one functioned in their own tunnel. I'm dealing with development, and we can't look into human rights. That's too political. I'm dealing with peacekeeping here, and so human rights is out. What happened is that the UN has been criticized justifiably for letting down people in countries such as the former Yugoslavia during the Balkans conflict, Rwanda, where the UN pulled out in the middle of the conflict. More recently, Sri Lanka, where the UN pulled out with the Sri Lankans weeping, please stay and protect us. This is how the UN used to operate. With a great deal of effort from my office, strong support from the Secretary General, the UN has now adopted the rights up front policy, and that means all of us act together. And we started this in Ukraine and South Sudan. All departments and agencies of the UN act together. Our our purpose there is to protect the human rights of people. So I'm happy to say that the first incidents of protection came in South Sudan, when the two leaders began fighting, the president and the opposition leader. People immediately fled for their lives because it became an ethnic conflict, and they fled into the UN compound. The UN traditionally closed the gates and kept people out, and this time they opened the gates. So there are about 90,000 now in the UN compound. This is the change that has developed because we pushed the human rights approach all along until it got to every head of every agency. I mentioned to you that many countries come and tell me not to address this issue, that's not a human rights issue. I was completing my last few days as judge in The Hague on the International Criminal Court when my first visitors, to my surprise, were the ambassador of China based in The Hague. And the two of them came in to tell me, you're not to touch the Tibet issue because that's not a human rights issue. And I said, yeah, but the people in Tibet are human rights concerns. And please don't come and speak to me, I'm still a judge. Really, you shouldn't come and speak to me. They said, well, they came to invite me to visit China. That Mary Robinson, my predecessor, had visited China 6 times. And I really thank them for the invitations. It's really good. And for 6 years, I've been trying to get them to fix a date. And I never got the date, so I didn't go to China. Many countries like China do not open up their countries for our visits, for the special rapporteurs' visits, and for us to open country offices there. I think that I'm heading towards the end of my time, and in our discussion we can talk about these huge conflicts such as Syria, such as the work of the commissions of inquiry set up by the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council, I think, should be credited for setting up these investigating committees and then looking for follow-up on what to do. They're all measures to try to get states to respect the rule of law, to protect their people, and to provide redress for victims, both justice and reparation. The Security Council has now set up a commission of inquiry for Central African Republic. The African Union has set up a commission of inquiry for South Sudan. So once again, very good examples being followed by the UN. Now, human rights and democratic principles have been the founding values of the African National Congress, and almost immediately after the end of apartheid in 1993-94, a number of human rights treaties were ratified by South Africa. And in November 2007, South Africa became one of the first batches of countries to ratify and sign the International Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities and its optional protocol. Nevertheless, it is unfortunate that South Africa has not ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Cultural, and Social Rights, which entered into force in June 1976, nor has it signed the optional protocol to the International Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, and Degrading Treatment or Punishment, a treaty that was pushed by South Africa, as I said to you earlier, soon after the killing of Steve Biko. South Africa's fight against apartheid is one that not only influenced the United Nations human rights agenda, but also created the expectation that South Africa would emerge as a principled voice of fundamental human rights on the international scene. The lives lost to apartheid and the support mobilized against it, both within and beyond the borders of South Africa, means that it can use its standing in the world to advocate for causes that espouse and uphold the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. South Africa's constitution is one of the most advanced in the world in terms of human rights. All the principles of the Universal Declaration are in our constitution. Our judiciary, particularly our Constitutional Court, has enormous respect. I meet with judges all over the world. I've been to 79 countries and met with chief justices, and they all know the work of our Constitutional Court. So we have good institutions. We have a role to play. Let me give you a little example of how vulnerable most people are in some countries. I went to a country in West Africa. I was focusing on early and forced marriage of girls. And I spoke to the minister in charge of family and gender. And I said, is it true that 10 years ago, Parliament passed a law on a reform package of the civil procedure and criminal procedure, and this issue of early marriage would fall under that? I said, is it true that Parliament passed this law 10 years ago, but the President has not signed it into law? And she said, no, that's not true. It's 19 years ago that the Parliament passed it, and the President has not signed it. So let's look at how fortunate we are in our country to have institutions in place. But outside there, we have to reach out to those communities and help them and be the moral voice to governments in many parts of the world, including South Africa, to follow some of our good examples. Now, South Africa, as I said, has led on a number of important human rights initiatives during the intergovernmental debates, and this includes taking an active and a proactive stand in combating racism, which led to the adoption of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. South Africa has supported resolutions against Israeli occupation of Palestine. It has given support for economic, social, and cultural rights that aim to eliminate poverty. and has supported the first UN resolution on sexual orientation and gender identity. However, South Africa can do more and should not lend support to decisions that conflict with its constitutional values. And these include recent resolutions on the right to protest. Now, on the right to protest, which side do you think South Africa should be on? On our constitutional value, which protects the right to protest. South Africa shouldn't find itself in a position where it takes the side of certain states who either call for a no-action motion, in other words, kill the resolution, or who say this is interference in the sovereign affairs of a country. I can't tell you how many people said to me, yeah, but apartheid government said the same, that it's our internal affairs, don't interfere, but the world did interfere. They cared about ending South Africa. So South Africa shouldn't, ending apartheid, South Africa should not be taking the same positions of governments with whom it enjoys a political relationship just to stop important resolutions. One is on reprisals against human rights defenders. I forgot to mention in my lecture to you how concerning it is where the world is going with regard to suppressing dissent. There are now countries who've adopted laws restricting non-governmental organization, Russia included. They restrict them from receiving funding. Journalists are attacked and killed, 18 journalists killed in Somalia. Ethiopia has arrested and sentenced to huge terms of imprisonment journalists, professional journalists who wrote critical articles. Vietnam has sentenced a blogger to 18 years imprisonment. Now, think of reprisals. Those are all reprisals against human rights defenders who speak for you and I. The resolution before the Human Rights Council was asking the Secretary General to appoint a focal person to report on reprisals against human rights defenders and journalists who cooperate with UN mechanisms. So it was rather limited. That resolution was adopted by a narrow margin in the Human Rights Council. Those who voted against the resolution then took it up before the third committee of the GA and had it suspended. And much concern was raised with me about South Africa playing a leading role in having that resolution suspended. South Africa should be on the side of reporting and taking action against reprisals. So just some key examples. This positioning of not interfering in the internal affairs of a sovereign country was also adopted by South Africa along with several other countries in blocking an investigation of the mass killings in Sri Lanka, and particularly the killings during the last years of the conflict. So let me end by saying that people, not only in Africa, but all over the world, look to South Africa for moral leadership. The real challenge is to bring to life the realities of people's lives. I have been monitoring events in South Africa in my previous capacity as High Commissioner for Human Rights, but as I followed the news and the press, I could see how serious the grievances of people are against corruption and lack of accountability on the part of governments, municipal authorities, and so on, but above all about the lack of delivery of services such as water, such as education, housing, and treatment of the right to protest. So that's why I say it's very important that we bring to life the realities of peoples. It's all very well to go around the world saying we have a good constitution and very good judicial system. What's the reality of people's lives really in terms of realizing their human rights? So I would say that the rule of law that South Africa cherishes, the rule of law that member states have cherished outside at the summit in 2005, every head of state committed to respecting the rule of law. It's very important then that we get them to respect that and to implement it. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Thank you.